She was just a waitress, living an ordinary life, until the night she was taken. Madison Brooks had dreams, ambitions, and a future. But in an instant, it was all stolen from her. Thrown into the dark world of underground auctions, she became nothing more than a prize, sold to the highest bidder for $5 million. The man who bought her? A ruthless Arab billionaire executive, Ryan Hale. Cold, calculating, and merciless, he didn't buy her for himself. She was meant to be a gift. But what happens when a man who never loses control becomes obsessed with his own possession? What happens when Madison realizes she's not just trapped? She's now owned. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more thrilling and shocking stories like this to you. The smell of cheap coffee and greasy burgers clung to Madison Brooks's uniform as she wiped down the counter of the small diner where she worked. It was late, past midnight, and the place was nearly empty. Just a few truckers finishing their meals, the neon lights flickering outside, casting a dim glow through the window. She was exhausted. Another long shift, another night of dreaming about a life beyond this. College was her goal, but with her mother's medical bills piling up, Madison had no choice but to put her own dreams on hold. The bell over the door jingled. A man walked in. He was dressed differently from the usual customers. Dark suit, crisp, expensive. He didn't belong here. His gaze scanned the room before settling on her. Madison forced a polite smile. "Welcome. Can I get you something?" The man didn't respond. He just watched her for a moment, a strange, assessing look in his eyes. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't know it then, but that moment would be the last time she would ever feel safe. The next thing Madison remembered was the sound of her own scream. A cloth pressed over her mouth, the sharp, stinging scent of chemicals filling her nose. She struggled, kicked, fought. But the hands holding her were strong. Then, darkness. When she woke up, everything was different. The floor beneath her was marble, cold against her bare legs. The room was massive, dimly lit, filled with shadows. And around her, voices, men murmuring in a language she didn't understand. She was no longer in her small-town diner. She was somewhere else, somewhere dangerous. Her breath hitched when she tried to move, only to realize her wrists were bound in front of her with a delicate gold chain, not tight enough to hurt, but enough to send a message. Panic surged in her chest. Then, a deep voice echoed through the room. "She's perfect." Madison turned toward the voice, her heart pounding. A man stepped into the light. Ryan Hale. Even if she didn't know his name, she would have recognized him. He was the kind of man whose presence demanded attention, towering, broad-shouldered, exuding power with every step he took. His sharp, chiseled features were unreadable, his dark eyes cold as they flicked over her. Madison trembled. "$5 million," another voice announced from behind her. "Sold to Ryan Hale." A rush of murmurs filled the room, but Madison barely heard them. Sold, like she was an object, a possession. Tears burned her eyes as Ryan stared at her with nothing but calculation. No warmth, no emotion. She was nothing to him. And yet, something inside her whispered that this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The world around Madison felt like a blur, voices fading in and out, the weight of reality crushing her chest. She had been sold. The golden chain around her wrists was delicate but unbreakable, a cruel irony for something meant to symbolize beauty. She was no longer a person in her own right. She was a possession, a prize taken by the highest bidder. Ryan Hale. The name rang in her mind as she was roughly pulled to her feet by one of the auction attendants. Her legs trembled beneath her as she was led toward the man who now owned her. Ryan stood tall, his expression unreadable, his black suit pristine, untouched by the filth of the world he had just bought her from. He didn't look at her like a man fascinated by beauty. He looked at her like an acquisition, something he had purchased for a reason beyond desire. "Do not waste my time," he said smoothly, his voice low and controlled. "Move." Madison's stomach twisted, but fear forced her feet forward. She wanted to scream, to run, but where would she go? The men in the room, the guards at the doors. There was no escape. Ryan didn't touch her as they left the auction hall, but his presence was suffocating. As they walked through the dimly lit corridor, Madison forced herself to speak, her voice shaky. Why did you buy me?" Ryan didn't slow down, nor did he spare her a glance. "You were a business transaction," he said simply. Nothing more. Her heart pounded. "A business transaction?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He stopped suddenly, and she nearly crashed into his back. When he turned, his dark eyes locked onto hers, unreadable but sharp. "You weren't bought for me," he said, his tone almost bored. "You were meant to be a gift." Madison's stomach dropped. A gift? For who? The thought sent ice through her veins, but before she could ask, the doors ahead of them opened, revealing a black car parked in a private underground garage. A driver stood waiting, no one else. Ryan stepped forward first, giving her a look that sent a clear message. Get in or be forced to. She hesitated. Ryan sighed, impatience flickering across his face. "Defiance doesn't interest me." He moved swiftly, gripping her chin between his fingers, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to remind her that she was not in control. "You are nothing to me," he murmured, his voice laced with chilling detachment. "Do not mistake this for something it is not." A tear slid down Madison's cheek. Ryan let go, stepping back. "Get in the car." With no choice left, she obeyed. As the doors closed around her, sealing her fate, one question haunted her mind. Who was she being given to? And why did it feel like the worst was yet to come? Ryan Hale sat motionless beside Madison in the back seat of the sleek black car, his presence suffocating despite his silence. His posture was composed, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights, as if she wasn't even there. But she was. Bound, afraid, and drowning in uncertainty. Madison clenched her fingers around the delicate golden chain still wrapped around her wrists, her breathing shallow as the weight of her fate pressed down on her. She had been sold, purchased like an object for a staggering $5 million by a man who regarded her with nothing but cold indifference. And yet, she wasn't even meant for him. She was a gift. The thought alone made her stomach turn. She wanted to scream, to beg for answers, but she knew that Ryan wasn't the type of man to entertain pleas for mercy. His aura exuded power, control, and something far more unsettling: ruthlessness. Still, the silence was unbearable. The unknown was worse than anything she had already endured. She needed to know where he was taking her, what was going to happen next. Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Where are you taking me?" Ryan didn't even glance in her direction. His expression remained unreadable, his eyes locked on the darkened skyline as he responded, his tone devoid of any warmth. "To the one who should have placed the highest bid." Her breath hitched, panic clawing at her throat. What do you mean? Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, but there was no flicker of emotion, no sign that her distress meant anything to him. You weren't meant to be mine. The words sent ice through her veins. Then why did you— Because I didn't let him. Ryan cut her off, his voice sharp, final. Madison's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The way he said it. It wasn't just a business transaction. It wasn't just about money. There was something more beneath the surface, something darker, something she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it a personal rivalry? A show of dominance? Had he taken her just to spite someone else? The thought made her stomach churn. She wanted to ask more, to push for answers, but before she could form the words, the car slowed, pulling up to an entrance that made her breath catch. Towering glass doors led into a lavish hotel, the kind reserved for billionaires, world leaders, and men who lived above the law. It was pristine, with golden accents reflecting the glow of the chandeliers inside. The level of wealth surrounding her was suffocating. The driver exited first, moving swiftly to open Ryan's door. Ryan stepped out smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit with effortless precision. He looked completely at ease, as if this moment was nothing more than another business deal. Then he turned, his dark eyes settling on her. She didn't move. Ryan's expression didn't shift, but there was something behind his gaze, something that warned her against disobedience. "Get out!" Madison's pulse pounded, her body frozen between fear and the desperate, useless urge to run. But where could she go? There were guards stationed near the entrance, their presence subtle but unmistakable. Even if she managed to bolt, she wouldn't get far. Ryan sighed, the sound barely audible but laced with irritation. "Do not test my patience." Trembling, Madison forced herself to slide out of the car, her legs unsteady beneath her. The cold night air did nothing to soothe the fire of anxiety burning through her veins. Ryan gave a small nod to the driver before placing a hand on Madison's lower back, guiding her forward with a touch that wasn't gentle, but wasn't forceful either. It was controlled, just like everything else about him. The moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The scent of expensive cologne and fresh-cut flowers filled the grand lobby. Everything was polished to perfection. Marble floors, glittering chandeliers, velvet chairs arranged in intimate corners. Guests dressed in designer clothing moved gracefully through the space, their conversations hushed, their eyes full of secrets. No one looked twice at them. To them, she wasn't a captive. She wasn't a girl stolen from her world and thrust into another against her will. She was just another accessory in a place where money could buy anything. Madison swallowed hard as Ryan led her toward the elevator. The moment the doors closed behind them, sealing them in, she felt her knees weaken. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "The man you were supposed to give me to?" Ryan leaned against the elevator wall, watching her with an expression that revealed nothing. "You will find out soon enough." Her stomach twisted painfully. "Please," she tried again, her voice breaking. "I don't belong here. I don't—" "You do not have a choice," he interrupted, his tone dangerously quiet. Tears stung her eyes. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to breathe, to stay upright, to not crumble in front of him. Ryan watched her for a moment longer before shifting his gaze to the glowing numbers on the elevator panel. "Defiance will get you nowhere," he murmured, almost to himself. She said nothing. The elevator chimed softly as the doors slid open, revealing an exclusive penthouse level. The hallway was silent, lined with doors that led to suites larger than entire mansions. Ryan stepped forward, and Madison had no choice but to follow. He stopped at a door at the far end of the corridor and entered a code on the panel beside it. A small green light blinked, and the door unlocked with a soft click. The room inside was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a stunning view of the city, luxury dripping from every inch of the space. Crystal chandeliers, silk-covered furniture, artwork that probably cost more than an entire neighborhood. But despite the beauty, the place felt cold, like Ryan himself. Madison hesitated at the threshold, her body screaming at her not to step inside. But Ryan didn't wait for her to make a decision. He simply walked in, expecting her to follow. With no other option, she stepped forward. The door shut behind her. She was trapped. Ryan moved toward the bar at the far end of the room, pouring himself a drink. He didn't offer her one, didn't even acknowledge her presence. Finally, he spoke. "You will stay here tonight." Madison's breath caught. "And tomorrow?" Ryan sipped his drink, his gaze locking onto hers over the rim of the glass. "Tomorrow, you meet the man you were meant for." Her blood ran cold. Her nightmare was just beginning. Madison barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the nightmare replayed in her head. The auction, the golden chain around her wrists, Ryan's cold, detached stare as he purchased her like she was nothing more than an object. But the worst part wasn't what had already happened. It was what was coming next. She was nothing to Ryan Hale. He had made that clear. She wasn't his. She was meant for someone else. And by this time tomorrow, she would be standing in front of the man she was supposed to belong to. The thought alone made her stomach churn. The penthouse was silent except for the occasional sound of the city far below. Even in the dark, she could see the extravagant details of the space, the marble floors, the velvet drapes, the breathtaking skyline stretching beyond the glass windows. She had never been in a place so luxurious, so suffocatingly expensive. And yet, she had never felt more trapped. Her eyes flickered to the door. Locked. Of course it was. She exhaled shakily and turned her head toward the other side of the room. Ryan was there, sitting in an armchair near the fireplace, his long legs stretched out, a glass of dark liquor resting in his hand. He wasn't asleep. He was watching her. Her breath hitched. "How long are you going to stare at me?" she whispered, her voice raw. Ryan's fingers traced the rim of his glass, his expression unreadable. "You're restless." Madison swallowed hard. "Of course I am." His gaze didn't waver. He looked at her as if she were an equation to be solved, something to be understood on a level she couldn't comprehend. "You will not be harmed," he said simply, as if that meant anything. She let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Ryan didn't react. He simply tilted his glass and took a slow sip. "It should." Madison clenched her fists. "You're a monster." For the first time, something flickered behind his dark eyes. Amusement, maybe. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "A monster would have left you in that auction," he murmured. She shuddered at the reminder. He was right. Things could have been worse. She had seen the way some of the other men at the auction had looked at her. Hungry, predatory. But that didn't mean Ryan was good. Not by any definition. He was just as dangerous, only in a different way. Madison forced herself to sit up, the silk sheets pooling around her legs. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan didn't pretend to misunderstand. "The man I was supposed to give you to?" he mused, swirling the liquor in his glass. She nodded. Ryan exhaled slowly, as if considering how much to tell her. Then, finally, he spoke. "Daniel Carter." The name meant nothing to her, but the way Ryan said it, calm, detached, yet with an undercurrent of something dark, made her stomach twist. "Is he like you?" she asked. Ryan's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than a yes would have. She felt her pulse quicken. "Then what is he?" Ryan leaned forward, setting his glass down on the table beside him. "A man who doesn't believe in returning what has been given." A chill crawled up her spine. Madison didn't know what that meant. Not exactly, but she knew it wasn't good. She swallowed. "Why did you stop him from bidding on me?" Ryan's gaze locked onto hers, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. "Because I don't like to lose." The air in the room felt heavier. Madison's breath came faster, her heart hammering against her ribs. "So this was just a game to you?" Ryan didn't answer. The silence was worse than words. Finally, he stood, his movements fluid and controlled. "Get some sleep, Madison." Her hands trembled as she gripped the sheets. "And if I don't?" Ryan took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "Then tomorrow will be much harder for you than it needs to be." A threat, a promise. Madison's throat tightened. Ryan studied her for a moment longer before turning away. "Good night." Then, without another word, he left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. She was alone, and tomorrow she would meet the man she was never supposed to escape. The morning came too soon. Madison had barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. She didn't know what awaited her today, but one thing was certain. Her nightmare was far from over. The penthouse was eerily quiet as she sat up in bed, the soft silk sheets pooling around her legs. For a fleeting moment, she almost believed she was waking up from a bad dream. But then she saw the golden chain still wrapped around her wrists, felt the cold weight of reality settle over her, and knew the truth. She wasn't free. The door to the bedroom swung open without warning, and Madison flinched. Ryan Hale stood in the doorway, his black suit impeccable, his expression unreadable as always. "Get up," he said smoothly. "We're leaving." She hesitated, her stomach twisting. "Where are you taking me?" Ryan's dark gaze met hers. "To Daniel Carter." The name sent a shiver through her. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to scream and fight and make him see that she wasn't a piece of property to be handed off like a business deal. But she knew it would be useless. Ryan had made one thing painfully clear. She had no choice. With trembling hands, she pushed the covers aside and stood, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. Ryan's eyes flickered over her briefly, assessing, but there was no emotion in his gaze. A dress had been laid out for her at the foot of the bed, elegant, expensive, made of black silk. It was beautiful, and it made her sick. She swallowed hard. "Do I at least get to choose what I wear?" Ryan's lips quirked slightly, as if amused by the question. "No." Her fingers curled into fists, but she said nothing. With stiff movements, she grabbed the dress and turned her back to him. She expected him to leave, to give her privacy, but he didn't. He simply stood there, waiting, his presence heavy in the room. A flicker of defiance sparked inside her. "Are you going to watch me change?" she challenged, her voice shaking but firm. Ryan arched a brow, his expression still maddeningly composed. Would it matter? Her cheeks burned, but she refused to back down. "It would to me." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he turned and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, he glanced over his shoulder. 5 minutes, he said coolly. Don't test me." The door shut behind him. Madison let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the dress. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to find a way out. But she knew better. Ryan was a man of control. If she even tried to escape, he'd find her before she made it past the hallway. She had no choice but to play along. For now. The car ride was silent, just like the night before. Ryan sat beside her, exuding power and detachment, completely unaffected by the fact that he was delivering a woman to another man like a commodity. Madison's hands clenched in her lap, the fabric of the dress smooth beneath her fingers. She didn't dare ask where they were going this time. She already knew. Daniel Carter. Who was he? What kind of man was he? If Ryan, the cold, ruthless billionaire beside her, had implied that Daniel was worse, then what did that mean for her? Her stomach twisted painfully. The city blurred past the tinted windows, the buildings growing taller, more luxurious. Whatever world she had been thrown into, it was one of wealth and excess, where money meant control and power dictated everything. She had always known men like Ryan existed. She had just never imagined she would become their possession. The car slowed in front of an estate that made Ryan's penthouse look modest. A towering mansion stretched across an endless expanse of pristine gardens and marble fountains. The gates opened automatically, as if expecting them. Ryan didn't move as the car pulled into the circular driveway. He simply turned to her, his dark eyes void of emotion. "This is where you get off," he said smoothly. A lump formed in her throat. "And what happens to me now?" Ryan tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then, with infuriating indifference, he said, "That's no longer my concern." Madison's heart pounded against her ribs. This was it. Her fate, her future, everything, was now in the hands of a man she had never met. She wanted to beg, to plead with Ryan to stop this, to change his mind, but she knew better. He didn't care. She was nothing to him. The driver stepped out and opened the door. Ryan's gaze flickered over her one last time before he spoke, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "Be careful, Madison." Then, without another word, he stepped out first, waiting for her to follow. The moment her feet touched the pavement, a new fear settled over her. She had thought Ryan was the worst thing that could happen to her. She was about to find out how wrong she was. Madison's feet felt like lead as she stepped out of the car, the warm breeze doing nothing to soothe the cold terror settling deep in her bones. The mansion before her was overwhelming. Gates of iron, marble pillars stretching toward the sky, fountains sculpted with such precision that they looked like something out of a palace. Everything about this place screamed wealth, power, and danger. Ryan Hale walked ahead of her, his movements effortless, his suit pristine as he approached the grand entrance. He didn't turn to check if she was following. He didn't need to. She had no other choice. Her heart pounded as the heavy double doors swung open, revealing a breathtaking interior of black and gold. The floors were polished marble, the chandeliers dripping with crystal, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars and leather. The place was both stunning and suffocating. A man stood near the grand staircase. Daniel Carter. Madison recognized him instantly, though she had never seen him before. There was something about the way he held himself, the quiet arrogance, the sharp smirk tugging at his lips as his piercing blue eyes flickered over her. He was just as powerful as Ryan, but where Ryan was cold and calculating, Daniel was something else entirely, unpredictable, dangerous. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, his gaze lingering a second too long, a dark amusement dancing behind his eyes. Ryan stopped a few feet away from him, his expression unreadable as always. Daniel. Daniel's smirk widened. Ryan, you kept me waiting. Ryan didn't react. You know I don't like to lose. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Ah, so that's what this was about. His eyes slid back to Madison, and a slow, knowing grin spread across his face. You bid against me just to win. Madison's breath hitched. That's why Ryan had bought her. It wasn't about her at all. It was about power, control. Daniel took a step forward, studying her with an unsettling curiosity. And now you're finally delivering my prize? Madison stiffened. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, but she knew she wouldn't make it 2 steps before one of them stopped her. Ryan remained silent for a long moment before speaking. She's yours. The words felt like a death sentence. Daniel exhaled, looking pleased. You always were a man of your word. Madison turned to Ryan, panic clawing at her throat. Please, she whispered, her voice shaking. Ryan's gaze met hers, dark and unreadable. For a fleeting second, something almost resembling hesitation flickered behind his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by the same detachment he had shown since the beginning. This was always the plan, he said smoothly. Madison's stomach twisted. Daniel extended a hand toward her, as if offering her a choice she didn't have. Come, he said, his voice silk over steel. She didn't move. Ryan exhaled sharply, the first real sign of impatience he had shown. Don't make this difficult. Her heart pounded. And if I do? Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, but it was Daniel who spoke. You won't like the consequences. The certainty in his voice made Madison's blood run cold. She turned to Ryan one last time, desperate. Don't do this. Ryan stared at her, his face a mask of control. Then, with infuriating calm, he said the words that shattered her last shred of hope. I already have. Daniel chuckled, stepping closer until he was right in front of her. See? That wasn't so hard. Madison trembled as his fingers brushed over the golden chain still wrapped around her wrists. And just like that, she knew. Ryan Hale had been a nightmare. But Daniel Carter? He was something far worse. Madison's pulse thundered in her ears as Daniel's fingers brushed over the golden chain still binding her wrists. Unlike Ryan, whose touch had always been cold and calculated, Daniel's was different. Casual, almost lazy, but beneath the surface lurked something sinister. She wanted to recoil, to yank herself away from him, but she knew better. Ryan Hale had been a nightmare, but Daniel Carter, he was something worse. Daniel's blue eyes studied her, a smirk tugging at his lips. You're shaking, he murmured, tilting his head slightly. Are you afraid of me, Madison? Madison clenched her jaw, forcing herself to lift her chin. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of answering. Daniel's smirk widened. Brave girl. His fingers curled around the chain, testing its weight. But bravery doesn't always end well. Ryan remained silent beside them, his face as unreadable as ever. He had done what he came here to do. He had delivered his gift. Now he would leave, and she would be alone with Daniel. Madison turned to Ryan, her last thread of defiance pushing her to try one last time. You don't have to do this, she whispered, her voice cracking. You don't have to leave me here. For the first time since they arrived, Ryan's dark eyes flickered with something she couldn't place. But the moment was brief, gone before she could grasp it. "This was always the plan," he said simply, echoing his words from before. Her chest tightened. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You're making this dramatic, Ryan." He turned his attention back to Madison, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I promise, I'll take good care of her." Something in Ryan's expression shifted. Something small, barely noticeable. But Madison saw it. Doubt. Ryan hesitated. Then, in a movement so swift it stole her breath, Ryan's hand shot out and grabbed Daniel's wrist, stopping him mid-touch. The room tensed. Daniel blinked, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Something wrong, Ryan?" Ryan didn't release his grip immediately. His fingers pressed into Daniel's skin, his jaw tight. "She's not yours yet." Madison sucked in a sharp breath. Daniel arched a brow. "Oh?" He glanced at Madison, then back at Ryan. "Are you changing the terms of our deal?" Ryan remained silent for a beat too long. Then, finally, he let go. "She's yours," he said, but there was something off about his tone. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head as if entertained. "Good." His gaze flicked to Madison, his smirk returning. "Shall we?" Madison's stomach lurched. Ryan turned away without another word, walking toward the exit with the same composed stride he always had. He wasn't going to look back. He wasn't going to change his mind. But as he reached the door, something in the air shifted. Daniel's grip on her chain tightened. Too tight. A silent warning. A message only Ryan would understand. Ryan stopped walking. The tension in the room became suffocating. Madison barely dared to breathe. Daniel smiled. "Problem?" Ryan turned his head slightly, just enough for Madison to see his profile. His face was unreadable, but his next word sent a shockwave through the room. "She's coming with me." Madison's breath hitched. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something dark flickered in his gaze. "Now, that's interesting." Ryan turned fully now, his stance composed, but there was something different about him, something colder. "The deal is off," Daniel chuckled, shaking his head as if Ryan had just said something amusing. "No, Ryan, you don't back out of deals." Ryan's eyes darkened. "I just did." Madison's heart slammed against her ribs. Daniel sighed, tilting his head slightly. "You do realize what this means, don't you?" Ryan's voice was like steel. "I don't care." A long silence stretched between them. Madison felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Then Daniel let out a quiet laugh. "Well," he murmured, releasing her wrists. "This is unexpected." Madison barely processed what was happening as Ryan took a step forward. "Come," he said simply. For a split second, she hesitated. Then her feet moved on instinct. She stepped toward Ryan, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Ryan turned without another word, leading her toward the door. Daniel didn't stop them. He didn't say a single word. But as Madison reached the threshold, she felt his gaze burning into her back, and she knew this wasn't over, not even close. Ryan had just started a war, and she was at the center of it. If this story has shocked you, moved you, or made your heart race, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. We've got many more intense, gripping tales coming your way, filled with suspense, emotional twists, and characters who will keep you at the edge of your seat. Hit the bell to turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the action. And remember, every story we share is a reminder that nothing in life is ever truly as it seems. Share this with someone who loves a thrilling, unforgettable journey, and let's keep spreading stories that challenge us, surprise us, and keep us wanting more. Until next time, stay strong and never stop believing in your own power to overcome the impossible. Don't miss what's coming next.